We want to welcome you out to our Building God's Way seminar today. And this is a really new experience, I know, for all of us. Typically, we are sitting in a room face to face with you, your church, your ministry leaders. But no, in this time of a pandemic, as our world has just changed around us the last few months, we wanted to take this opportunity to connect directly with you as a pastor, ministry leader, as you're looking to the future for your church and your ministry, and have a conversation with you today about what it means to be embedded churches that are in the center of life and activity in our cities and in our communities. My name is Matt Roberts. I have the privilege of being a lead pastor of a local church called the Genesis Project that spans over 5 campuses. And the Genesis Project is a 12-year-old church in Ogden, Utah, that we have just seen God bless in some pretty amazing ways. In the heart of our ministry, and now all 5 of our locations, is to be a ministry that goes into some of the hardest and darkest places of our nation with the light, the good news, and the hope of Jesus Christ. And man, what a time we are living in today, where I believe hope is so important, such a needed commodity that seems to have been lost by our generation. This year, 2020, seems to have just hit all of us with a haymaker. And I think it's important that we begin today with a firm foundation of understanding who and what and where Jesus has called and created us as his church to be inside of our community. I'm sure you, as a pastor, just like me and my team, are just sitting and waiting to see what this new normal looks like. There's probably many of you watching that are still waiting to gather again in your auditoriums and your sanctuaries. Some that have come back only to realize that things didn't pick back up right where they left off. Maybe a lot of us are amending our vision for this year, amending strategic plans, and trying to lay out a path in front of us as to how we move forward, how we take on the tension that exists inside of our world while continuing to shine the light of Jesus in the darkest corners of your city, your community, and your world. The other day, I was driving down the road in my town. And as I was cruising down the interstate, I just happened to come across this vehicle that had a bumper sticker that I had seen before, but not for a while, so it caught my attention. You may have seen this bumper sticker. It read, "Jesus is my copilot." As I was thinking about the implications of that bumper sticker and really what that meant, this car all of a sudden veered across like 2 lanes of traffic, was speeding up, slowing down, cut off an individual that was in front of them, and as they got off the exit of the interstate, raised their hand out the side window, giving that 1-finger salute, telling everybody around them that they were number 1 that day. I couldn't help but think that that's actually how my life looks when I invite Jesus to be my co-pilot. Because faith really is much more about submission than it is collaboration. And sometimes, I know for me as a pastor, I get in this mindset, in this ideology that I'm steering this church, that I'm the one in charge, that the buck stops with me. And man, that's never a power play for me. It's actually a source of a ton of stress and anxiety. And today, man, if you're sitting back listening to this opening session, and as a church leader, a pastor, you're experiencing some of that anxiety. If you're going through a season and a time right now where you're just trying to figure out which way to go, and maybe it feels like your life and your leadership and your ministry are just kind of swerving all over the place, can I challenge you today, as God has been challenging me as a leader, that maybe we need to consider who's piloting this ship, and maybe invite Jesus in the middle of this unprecedented time to move from the co-pilot chair into the pilot seat. to turn over our hopes and our dreams and our fears and our ambitions and our plans to him. Today I want to share with you out of the Old Testament book of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 22, we find that Israel is in a dark, scary, tumultuous place in their history. The northern kingdom of Israel has already fallen at this point in time, and the only tribe that is left of the 12 tribes of Israel is the tribe of Judah that is camped out in the capital city, the southern kingdom of Jerusalem, and sitting on pins and needles, knowing that this world power of Assyria is coming towards them to conquer them, to take them over. They know that destruction and bloodshed is in front of them. And what we know about Assyria is that they were one of the very first world powers, that they had a military that was stronger than anything that Israel had ever stood up against. It was actually Assyria that figured out how to make iron weapons, which were stronger than the bronze weapons that came before them, but also gave Assyria the opportunity to mass produce these weapons for large armies. And they would use intimidation tactics from town to town, conquering them so wholly and so completely that word would spread to the world around them that Assyria was coming and there was no point standing against them, that any type of opposition would be futile. And so we come to the preparations of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah and the capital city of Jerusalem in Isaiah chapter 22. And what we find in verse 1 of that chapter is this rebuke, this condemnation to the valley of vision. And what a powerful statement. I think there's a lot of us here that maybe as church leaders find ourselves in the valley of vision. We find ourselves in the shadow of what we thought was going to be. We find ourselves knocked off center and caught off guard by a world that's changing faster around us than we can keep up with. And it's to that valley of vision that Israel finds themselves in that we read these words. Isaiah chapter 22, verses 8 through 11. And God said, to the people of Jerusalem, you assessed your defenses that day. You inspected your arsenal of weapons in the forest armory. You found the weak places in the city walls that needed repair. You secured the water supply at the lower pool. You took an inventory of the houses in Jerusalem and tore down some to get bricks in order to fortify the city wall. You even built large cisterns in the city to ensure plenty of water. You looked and looked and looked, but never once did you look to him who gave you this city. Never once did you consult the one who has long had plans for your people. What a powerful statement that I think is so applicable to you and I as leaders today. Sometimes our knee-jerk reaction in confusing and fast-moving times is to start to plan, to do exactly what Israel did in Jerusalem when they knew that impending doom from Assyria was coming. They did everything they could to fortify the walls, to make sure they were ready for a battle that was coming their way, to make sure that they could lock down that city and protect what was inside from the enemy that was coming. And a few things that I want to share with you in this opening session that we find in Isaiah chapter 22 starts with this truth. A valley is a hard place to find vision. Israel felt defeated, beat down. People were bailing left and right. They stood against an army and an enemy that seemed insurmountable. And in the middle of that chaos and confusion, they desperately tried to dream about a new future. They desperately tried to plan what was next. They laid out to the best of their ability strategy and work. But in the middle of all of it, they forgot to consult the God who gave them that land, the God who called them to be his people. And I think maybe there's a lot of us that are tuning in and listening today that need to have this simple reminder that we have already been given the answer in Jesus Christ. He has already overcome this world. And man, something that's so important for me to remember as a pastor and a church leader is that God was not caught off guard by COVID-19. He wasn't caught off guard by the chaos and the division and the polarization that is all around us in our world today. He tells us that his word, his presence will always be a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. And when we find ourselves as church leaders beat down and tired, when we find ourselves unsure of what tomorrow is going to hold, when we find ourselves at a place where we are just frustrated by the steep and imposing hill that stands in front of us, may we never forget to keep our eyes on Jesus as we read in Hebrews chapter 12, the author and perfecter of our faith. Because we can get so caught up by paying attention to the things that are around us, paying attention to what the news cycle is telling us on any given day. Pay attention to what our people are saying. Pay attention to what Facebook is saying about your church, your life, your ministry, your leadership. And those things can just defeat us before we ever start and we ever begin. And today, man, for every leader out there that finds themselves in the valley of vision, can I encourage you that God has called you to lead, that he has placed you strategically and specifically in all of his sovereignty right where you are at today, that he has called you to lead, and no matter how scary tomorrow may look, you have everything you need in Jesus to take this next hill, to be the light that your city so desperately needs, to be love in the face of hatred, to be hope in the face of hopelessness. The second thing that we learn in Isaiah chapter 22 is that we make bad decisions when we're afraid. What we know is that Israel actually, in Isaiah chapter 22, we're told they aligned themselves with Babylon. Now, Babylon had always been an enemy of Israel, but Israel chose in their fear to say, man, if we can strike some type of an alliance with Babylon, Babylon can actually make us stronger, help us stand against the Assyrians, which if you study the history of the Old Testament, what you will come to learn is this, that it was ultimately Babylon that destroyed Israel, not Assyria. See, it was their fear that led them to a place where they made knee-jerk reactions and ultimately invited the enemy into their camp. And I know, man, we are surrounded by fear. Our people inside of our congregations are afraid. I think all of us, if we were honest, just have a little bit, maybe a lot of trepidation as we move into the future. Fear about what our churches are going to look like when this is over a few months from now. Fear about where our country, where our nation, where the church is headed. And may we remember that throughout the Bible, 365 different times, we find this commandment, do not fear. And most of the time, we read that commandment, it's followed by this promise, for I am with you. And what a powerful promise of presence. that reminds us that God is still in control, and no matter how crazy the world might feel around us right now, we do not have to be a people as the Church of Jesus Christ who operate, who function in fear, for he is with us. The third thing that we find in Isaiah chapter 22 is that the church belongs to God. It's his. And that ownership is so important, pastor and leader, for me to remind myself as I look out at our church week after week, as I worry and I pray for the people that God has brought into our community. It's a heavy load to carry. And I know that there are so many of you listening today that are carrying that heavy load of responsibility that God has given us as shepherds and pastors and leaders of congregations. And I'm sure, just like me, there's so many of us that are just afraid of what tomorrow looks like for our churches, afraid if there's even room for us to move forward, afraid to dream about a tomorrow that we just don't quite understand. And it's so important to remember that this doesn't belong to me. That the Genesis Project here in Ogden, Utah, didn't originate with me. It wasn't my idea. But it was God's plan, God's purpose for this city long before this guy even stepped into existence. And ultimately, the church belongs to Jesus. It's his church. And as we're reminded in this text in Isaiah 22, God said, man, you looked at how you were going to survive. You looked all around you for how you could make yourself stronger, but not once did you look to the God who owns this city, the God who gave it to you as a gift, the God who is still sovereign in the midst of chaos, still sovereign, Israel, in the midst of war and madness, still sovereign in 2020 when it feels like everything is going wrong and running off the rails. He is the author and perfecter of this story. The church belongs to him. And as we talk about today, strategic planning and mission and vision and space and building and expansion, can I encourage you to take a step of faith? For so many of us that are maybe type A leaders and so good at holding on to stuff, just to open up our hands and open up our heart and say, God, I give my church back to you because it was never mine. I give my worry and my anxiety and my fear and my confusion to the God who gave it all to me to start with. You see, our best laid plans will always fall short. And today, we're going to talk a lot about building and architecture and design. We're going to talk about strategic planning and amalgamating a business model inside of your church to be a funding mechanism for your ministry. We're going to talk about some new and hopefully exciting things that stir something inside of you as a church leader. But before we have any of those conversations, let us pay close attention that we don't buy into the chaos of our culture and become Israel in Isaiah 22 that looked and looked and looked, that looked at our buildings, that looked at our design, that looked at the flow, that looked at our people, that looked at our planning and our mission and our vision and our values, but don't start on this very beautiful and established foundation of Christ. That we belong to him. In every conversation that we're going to have today, our hope as a team, our hope as a company here at Building God's Way is this: that the prayer that Jesus prayed over us would be in everything that we do, everything that we say. Your kingdom come, your will be done here in this city, in your city, in your church, around the boardroom tables that maybe you're meeting in right now. That the God who gave us this beautiful thing called the church, his bride, that the God who has established his mission and vision of embedment in ministry in your community would ignite a fresh vision and a fresh fire inside of you. That we would see the chaos around us, the crisis that exists in our world today, not as a hindrance to be the church, but maybe just the opportunity that God created us to grab a hold of. And so our prayer for you, our prayer for your church and your ministry today is that you would find that fresh vision, that you would find that still small voice of God that would lead you maybe through a valley that you've been in your life, that you would hear the clear call of God, that we are his church, and the gates of hell and the attacks of our enemy will not prevail against us. So let us move forward in conversation with courage in the face of some scary things, with clarity in the middle of a valley, and with a fresh and renewed hope in a God who is moving all around us.